Hello and welcome to another edition of the NRS Insights Podcast. I'm John Lovestock, and I'm happy to be joined again today by Susie Silliman, who is the Senior Vice President of Data Strategy and Sales at NRS, National Retail Solutions, and Brandon Thurber, who is the Vice President of Data Sales and Client Success at NRS. And today we will be discussing NRS Insights for January 2024, the NRS Insights Retail Same Store Sales Report. So it's a new year, January 2024. How do we do, guys? Welcome, first of all.
Hi, John.
Welcome. Thanks for hosting us, John.
My pleasure.
So kicking off the new year, it's hard to believe we're talking about a new year already. And as we sit here, we're a month in. But traffic is about flat year over year in the month of January. So predictably, some areas of the country experienced some bad weather, kept people inside, and we did see a drop in traffic and dollar sales compared to from December to January, and that's also predictable. A lot of dynamics change, consumer behavior changes with the new year, New Year's resolutions, dry January, etc. So there's a lot to unpack there.
So there were some upsides, right? If I'm reviewing the report correct. So tobacco, candy, all did well, but specifically, or no?
Actually, that's the other way around. When you think about these resolutions, right? Folks are, trying to commit to a healthier lifestyle, maybe breaking some habits. And so from those categories that you just mentioned, particularly, broadly speaking, tobacco alternatives, candy, desserts, etc., we actually saw a decline in dollars and quantity in baskets.
That's from what, January 1st to January 3rd, right? That's because that's usually
but there's always some upside or niches within those categories that show some insights that aren't obvious at that aggregate level. And Brandon, why don't you talk about that from a tobacco alternative perspective?
Sure.
Yeah, so nicotine pouches are definitely on scene. These are non-tobacco nicotine pouches. They represent 30 to 40% of the category when you put them in with smokeless. So those brands compared to your more traditional smokeless, and they have doubled in sales January 2024 versus January 2023. So that is some pretty substantial growth.
And Brandon, this was the highest month ever for pouches, correct?
That is correct. And the top brand in that non-tobacco nicotine segment overtook the top brand in the traditional smokeless. So that was a pretty substantial finding in our network.
Yeah, so it's interesting because what I'm seeing in social circles is that the pouches are very female friendly. I'm seeing them in friends of mine's purses, etc., who aren't going to take a dip of sort of traditional smokeless tobacco.
Yeah, big wad of Copenhagen at a social gathering is probably not very ladylike. Anyway, along those lines, how about dry January? Was that a real thing? What did you guys
Definitely a real thing. So interesting, that impacts traffic as well. So 58% of the time, beer is purchased by itself. So if a consumer is walking into one of our stores and buying beer, they're not including anything else in the basket. So if they're not walking into that store buying beer, because beer was down about 1 or 2% versus last year, which that's a category in our stores at least. It's been up almost double digits each month. So that was kind of a two-tailed phenomenon.
Right. But John, as we spoke last month, there is increasing popularity and emergence of the non-alcoholic segments within beer, seltzer, wine, and spirits. And those definitely showed promise. Brandon, again, can recite some stats in terms of this increase in stores carrying that segment the proliferation of offerings in those segments and how that's really changed over the last year. You might remember, John, last year at NACS, Brandon and I had a education session, which was sort of what convenience can learn from the bodega. And we mined a lot of the data, and what the insights revealed, particularly on that non-alcoholic space, was that the retailers that were carrying a few NA varieties in beer, FMB, cider, seltzer, were outperforming the stores that were not. And the recommendation that we had made at that time to the retailers that were in the audience is, listen, if you're not carrying any SKUs in NA today, you need to, because you're attracting a different shopper who is not going to substitute an alcoholic version with, instead, if the non-alcoholic version is not available, they will go somewhere else. And, what we've seen in the last year is that there's more and more stores that are carrying that. Brandon, do you want to speak to the numbers?
Sure. So year-over-year growth at 23%, fastest growing segment in all of beer. So that's pretty substantial, making a big difference. And the other growth component is if a store is in that segment, they're carrying one additional variety year over year. So if they were carrying 3, now they're carrying 4, so on. However, there's still an opportunity for these manufacturers and these brands because they're only in about 50% of the stores that are selling beer. And as Susie mentioned, it's a great story. If they're carrying these kinds of items, that retailer and overall, the category is growing.
Right. And our recommendation is never with, some of these niche segments to go all in and put, 10, 20 SKUs on the shelf, but 1, 2, 3 top velocity. And what of course, John, but what some folks might not realize is the top distributed item, the number 1 item on a national level, might not be the best item to be on your shelf, because there could be brands that turn better than that number 1 item. They just haven't made it to as many shelves. So really try to get a handle on what items are selling better in the stores that they're selling, and just experiment, right? Experiment with 1 or 2 and see how that does. But we've talked about this again in the past, John, as well. Just putting that NA item on the shelf alone isn't enough. You have to let your shoppers know that it's now available, because if somebody who was looking for it came last week, it wasn't on the shelf, they automatically think that they can't go to your store to buy a non-alcoholic variety beer. Whereas once you start selling it, you do want to let your shoppers know that it is now available.
And it's a basket builder, which is what I think every retailer craves. Is one more item in the basket is a higher revenue ring and a little bit more profit. So that is, if you're reaching a consumer that wouldn't normally purchase the category, but for whatever reason they're hosting a party, they want to have an offering, it adds one more item to that basket, is important.
Yep. But John, in addition to where we saw some declines in categories where folks were making their New Year's resolutions, etc., we did, which is predictable as well, see a uptick in vitamins and supplements, in performance nutrition. And what falls into performance nutrition that's different than vitamins and supplements are those like performance shakes, your muscle milk, your core power, your bars like Quest and Lenny and Larry's. Those types of products all saw substantial gains, both versus December, of course, but also versus a year ago. So that was pretty interesting. And vegetables. So, and that sort of runs the gamut in terms of frozen vegetables, canned vegetables, fresh packaged vegetables that have a UPC. So just sort of bundling everything in vegetables. So they're from a shopping behavior perspective in the NRS network, we definitely were able to see a trend in January of folks being a bit more mindful about their health, wellness, and diet.
Sure. How about not a huge category, but medicinal items with it was a terrible cold and flu
Yep.
season.
And upper respiratory saw a huge increase. You know, double digit, more than double digit, even versus last year. And I think that that tracks with the increased cases of RSV, flu, COVID, the combination of those, you know, the human version of kennel cough, which hadn't fallen into any of those three categories. Like all of that was going around pretty heavily in January. I myself fell victim of COVID after going and watching the Steelers last game. Everybody in my crew ended up having COVID. So and I bought plenty of upper respiratory products during that wave and took them religiously every 4 hours, and it certainly helped.
Wow, insult to injury, huh? They didn't win, and you got
Oh
the.
my God, I know.
So one thing I'm trying to decipher here, and just looking at the numbers, is the impact of inflation. And so, am I reading this right? So trips were flat, and dollar sales are up, but the number of items purchased was down. So does that mean prices are higher? Did I interpret that right?
So no, inflation is kind of stymied a bit. It's inflation we're seeing in the top 500 most frequently purchased items and baskets. It's only up about 1.2%. So if you're measured on dollar sales, uh, we're going to be hitting some tough comparisons, I think. But I think that's okay. I think that's better for the U.S. consumer and an opportunity for folks to kind of get back to um, older purchasing behavior.
And John, it could also speak to mix, right? So, you know, a year ago, there could have been, even in the same category, a lower priced offering that was in the basket. And now, in at least in terms of in January of 2024, they have sort of traded up for a higher priced offering.
Okay, and I'm trying to think. I don't believe any states have enacted any tobacco taxes, so there's no pressing tax increases that took effect probably in January 24 that I'm aware of. I don't, maybe locally, but not at the state level
Not to my knowledge.
on tobacco products. It's usually like a January 1 thing, and I don't know of any this year.
I don't know I don't know offhand, but that's definitely something to look into. Another thing we are going to be looking into in terms of our analysis, of course, you know, we're predominantly in those you know, densely populated urban areas. What you continue to hear more and more of, I'll use San Francisco as an example, are sort of your bigger box stores that were in inner city areas closing down.
Mhm.
So you know, Target shut their doors in San Francisco, a couple of other cities, CVS, Rite Aid, Walgreens shutting down stores in inner city areas. And what that leaves then is that independent operator, the bodega, the convenience store, the small grocery corner store, to satisfy the shopping needs of, you know, that radius of population. So particularly in the cities that have had, you know, more than usual of these closures of retail, we're going to be monitoring what does that mean for the independent, because we would expect to see an increase in traffic and sales and dollars because more folks then are being drawn to that store, being that um, the outlets in their consideration set in their within a walkable radius is much smaller than a few months ago.
And you see some of the rebranding. Have you checked out what Dollar General has done with their DG Market, rebranding that, and they're kind of going after that, you know, urban. The format could go urban or more of a rural area. So it's a little more. There's a little more flexibility built into that model, which I think is exactly what you're saying. They're going after that segment. Be interesting.
Shameless, a shameless plug for next month. Hopefully, we'll be able to highlight San Francisco in a different light as we record this. The big football game is happening in a few days, so we're going to take a look at San Francisco and Kansas City and how maybe some of the premier snack brands and home party brands are doing compared to last year or compared to the pre-period to see if there's any kind of impact there.
Yeah, there is a ton of hype around the game this year. So I would suspect that people, let's put it this way, it's called Dry January, not Dry February for a reason. It wouldn't fly in
Absolutely.
February. And then yeah, the game being in Las Vegas is just it's gonna be such a show. All right, so any closing thoughts, guys, other than what to expect in Feb? Yep.
No, I think that's most of it. We're excited to dive into that and check out maybe some of the commercials as everyone else does, and see what if we see a bump in urban outlets.
Great. So if you guys are not, for our listeners who are not getting the same store sales report, Brandon, how do they get it?
Set your Google alerts to NRS same store sales report. It comes out once a month, usually the first week of the month, or if it depending on when that starts. And then you can also check it out at idt.net.
Yeah, and this comprehensive report, if I didn't say earlier, it comprises nearly 29,000 active point of sale terminals, representing about 25,000 independent retail stores, convenience stores, bodegas, liquor stores, etc. So real comprehensive. There's a lot of great numbers in there, so I highly recommend that everyone check it out. So on behalf of Susie and Brandon, I'm John Lovestock. I want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to have you again in a future NRS podcast. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.